So I talked to my mom and I said, do you want to go? If you want to go, you know, maybe we can convince Dad to go. And she said, I'd rather die here than live anywhere else without him. So I said, you got to tell me it's okay. What if I don't ever see you again? You know? And she said, it's okay. You can help more people if you're up there than you can here. So that was the hardest part. I mean, I can do emergency preparedness, I can do relief, but leaving them and not knowing what was going to happen was definitely the hardest thing I've ever done in my life.
When they actually call for an evacuation, they will make a pass around and they'll check enough to where they take their picture. That's how they say, you know, nobody's going to respond. Don't call for help. Nobody's coming.
So I was actually in the Emergency Operations Center, which is in Largo. I was just sort of covering the heart of everything, where all the response was organized and the storm updates were coming via news conference. But after the storm came or blew through, I actually ended up going out on a ride along with a Pinellas deputy who was sort of doing a first look at the damage from the storm and trying to decide when people could go on the roads again and things like that. So I was out within a couple hours after the storm blew through the area. But this one was a lot different because there was a lot of anticipation that came with it. A good week leading up to it, you know, it was sort of a mystery of where it was going to go. It was looking like Miami at first, and then it kept moving west, and it was looking like it was going to hit us directly as like a category 4 or 5 for a while, and then that changed as well. So by the time it actually came through Pinellas County in the Tampa Bay area, it was a category 1, and there was sort of this feeling of relief as it became clear it wasn't going to be as powerful as we once thought. But as I was going out with the deputy in the morning, it was still pitch black outside, and the wind was still howling, and it was still raining, and he was shining his floodlights on different sites, and we stuck pretty much to the beach for most of the morning, and there were still, you know, roofs blown off of houses, and in a tipped over Sunoco gas station, the roof caved in, and just all kinds of fire alarms going off at random buildings, and a lot of the barrier islands didn't have any power, down power lines everywhere, down trees. We had to drive around a lot of the debris. And at one point we even came across a dinner yacht that had escaped from its, I guess wherever it was chilling, yeah, and had blown over into a bridge that one of the Bayway bridges out to St. Pete Beach. So there were all kinds of things going on. Still, I think, you know, we came away relatively unscathed compared to what we were thinking we were going to face. But even with just a category 1 storm, I mean, there was a lot of significant damage and a lot of people coming home to you know, down trees in their yards or worse. And I think the real fallout came with the power outage situation. Some areas of the county didn't lose power at all, but most of the county did, and some people were without it for 5, 6, 7 days, and there was just sort of this constant accounting of, you know, checking in with the utilities and utility trucks coming in from all over the country to help repair the lines, and so that was definitely I think a sobering moment. Like, if this is what a category 1 storm does to our power grid, what are we going to do if it's worse? I actually, I'm going to get a lot of hate for this, but I actually did not lose power at all. But I was prepared to. I threw out all of my stuff in my fridge and you know, made sure I had battery packs for my phone and a power inverter for my car and things like that. Got tons of gas. And while I didn't end up needing it, it was much more comforting knowing it was there, especially as I was in the EOC and then out in the field reporting, knowing that, you know, I had left my apartment and my cat, and you know, knowing that I had the supplies that I needed gave me some peace of mind. And yeah, I mean, I I've lived in Florida for a long time, and I was in South Carolina before this, so I've always lived with hurricanes. But I think last year was sort of a chance to have a practice run for something that was bad, but wasn't as bad as it could have been, and to really take stock of your preparation and your expectations for a storm, and make sure you're prepared for a worse situation.
Myself and Lauren Elliott, a photographer, and Zach and Doug were all in the Emergency Operations Center in Charlotte County, which was like frankly the most southern and safe place that we could find to spend the night when the storm hit. And when they opened up the shelter, because they lock it down while they're a hurricane, tropical storm, force winds, and then they let everyone go. And so we spent the next day or so down in Collier County looking for damage, and we found some trailer parks that were totally decimated. And it was that afternoon that an editor had called and said, "We want you down at the Keys. They're opening up the upper portion of the Keys Tuesday morning at like 6 a.m., and we want you to be the first ones on it." So we scrambled to find a hotel room in Homestead, which was largely without power. In fact, we kept missing restaurants. We got to Homestead at 10 o'clock or 9-ish, and we found someone that said, if you go to this place, it's the one restaurant in town that's open. We get there, we served our last plate. If you go to this place, it's the next last restaurant in town open. And it was actually really frustrating because we hadn't eaten a real meal in a while. And in the end, we ended up having our Chef Boyardee or beans or whatever we had. And the next morning, we got up at like the crack of dawn, and we must have been car 75 let onto the Keys. And we had done some interviews with people as we were waiting, and people just were, champing at the bit to get back onto the Keys and see the damage to their homes. Some of them were second homeowners, but a lot of them, were native to the Keys.
It was comforting to come back and find people who were here to watch over, and the supplies were there too, the water, and the fire department's very gracious in giving out supplies.
My immediate family was in Winter Park, Florida. So I left them there. And actually, you just met Kasha. Her husband and I drove back. She wouldn't let me come back by myself, so her husband came with me. We cleared the first checkpoint, and I was in the military and responded to Andrew. And that's what I reminded me of. Driving down the Keys, I was like, oh my gosh, because while they had made a pass down the road, there wasn't much cleared yet.
What are you seeing? The most striking thing was that there were things on the road that didn't belong on the road, like refrigerators and sinks and jet skis. In fact, so the reason why they only let us down to mile marker 73 was because they had only cleared out the first 30 or so miles of road. Everything but the road was covered in sand. So they'd cleared debris off the roadway for 30 miles. But that meant that the grassy median going all the way down was just covered in people's belongings. I mean, everything. And that was really striking. It was really bizarre. I guess I should have expected that, but I didn't. And seeing just like the remnants of people's homes and people's lives scattered all over the roadway, like being driven on over by, things that obviously meant something to people that were now garbage. So Highway 1 is sort of the spine through all these islands, and these islands are pretty thin and narrow. And on one side, the ocean side, most everything had been affected in one way or another by the storm. And there were houses that were totally gone. A lot of the residents down there live in trailers or some sort of prefab homes, and a lot of those were washed away, lifted, and picked up and placed other places. But on the northern side of the road, the Gulf side, things were in much better shape. And it has to do with the fact that the storm, spins counterclockwise and was west, and so it was just battering the southern side of the islands. And it was really striking the difference between the northern side of the island. And these islands are thin in some places. They're like a tenth of a mile, and you could be on one side and be standing among total devastation, and you could look across the road and people managed to, didn't have any damage at all. That was one of the most striking things. And to Catherine's point about how the storm, had even up until a day before the storm hit, forecasters had been tracking the storm as, making landfall as east as Homestead and as west as Pinellas County. And if it had been east, then it would have been the homeowners on the northern side of the island who would have been battered by the storm surge and the waves. And it would have been the southern side of the islands that likely would have been, spared. I mean, you don't want to leave your life in the hands of luck. If the storm had been different, it would have been the other people. The lucky ones would have been unlucky, and the unlucky ones, may have fared better. But it's so fickle, and you can't planning, hoping for the best is not being prepared. But that being said, I think natives to the Keys have a chip on their shoulder, and Irma wasn't the first storm that they'd ridden out, and it likely won't be the last. And many of the people down there had this optimistic spirit and this, they were like, well, we're going to rebuild and we're going to stay. People seem really devoted to the Keys. It's a special place, and so. Maybe banking on luck wouldn't be my how I would go about it, but the people down there seem to really have a chip on their shoulder about it.
That night, Doug and I were sort of tasked with being the front crew to figure out where around landfall, the second landfall. And we were tasked with being the front crew out to figure out, okay, around the second landfall, which was at Marco Island, what does it look like? And at that point, the early reports of a storm are typically on social media from the few residents who decided, I'm not leaving. And there was some pretty dramatic footage of the winds on Marco Island, as well as what seemed to be a storm surge, but really no clarity on it. No major news crews had been out there. So Doug and I drove down from Charlotte County and got out to Marco Island. And as we got closer to Marco Island, it started to get a little bit rough, and you can see on the mainland portion that there were signs down, there were wires down you had to avoid, but it wasn't dramatically bad in the way that maybe the early reports had indicated. And so we were able to get out to Marco Island, and this is where Irma made second landfall. And it's, I think we were expecting pretty substantial destruction, and it really wasn't the case. And I think we were the first major news crew out there, and I think we filed our report at around 12:30 or 1 in the morning. And at that time, Marco Island was it was like a post-apocalyptic movie where it was abandoned and empty. There was debris in the streets, but the sort of most harrowing thing to see was that it was pitch black and all of the emergency alarms in the high-rise buildings were going off. And we filed a couple of videos from there on that. So that was striking because it's dead silent in a way that a place typically isn't dead silent. So all you hear is the waves, the residual winds, because at this point Irma is just sort of licking the bottom of Tampa Bay. It's really not totally clear. And then the sirens and the voices saying, leave the building, evacuate, evacuate, evacuate. And Doug and I were there, and that was our task for the night, was essentially to check on Marco Island. But given that it was clear to us that this isn't where the central danger was, we felt like we needed to push further south and check on Everglades City, which is, on a good day, maybe, 40 minutes you're going to make that drive. And this was obviously not a good day. So we tried to get out of Marco Island to the south to get to Everglades City, and we got into really deep water. Doug is a pretty aggressive person, and I'm a pretty aggressive person, and that's the only time we've ever turned back in a storm. And when I've been with Doug, and we turned around, and we worked our way the other way down into Everglades City. Part of the reason we felt we needed to get down there is Marco Island is a place where a lot of folks have second homes. Not everyone does. It's a fairly wealthy community, just on the outskirts of Naples, and it's well built. So in a storm like this, it has a higher chance, or it's more likely to survive maybe than some of the places that are not as structurally sound and maybe don't have quite as much money to invest in its infrastructure. So as you got out of Marco Island to the south, you started to hit some mobile homes or some prefab homes, and they were like tin cans. Pieces of them were ripped off, and you could see, okay, some wind came through here, and there are places that didn't fare as well, and that's the story we need to try to identify. You know, and just speaking, I don't want to speak for Doug, but I think that's part of the importance of us getting out there in that situation. We're not taking a risk that's necessarily going to get us hurt, because it doesn't benefit anybody if we don't file a story. But if we can get out there and we can file a story, we can lend some clarity to a situation that, you know, obviously the whole country is looking at right now. This is a pretty major storm. You know, and just a day and a half before, Doug and I had been in Miami, and the reports were that it was going to be like Katrina for Miami, and now it's blown away. But there's a lot of attention on this. So we get off Marco Island, and I was navigating, and I decided to take us down the Tamiami because it was a quicker route. It was probably not the best decision because it was really destroyed. And it was a very harrowing ride. We were under probably about 1.5 feet of water the whole way to 2 feet of water the whole way, and the tide was coming in across the street. And, you know, every 50 yards there was shattered utility poles, and there were wires down across the street, and we were constantly having to calibrate as we go down each wire. Do we drive over this? Is it live? Do we drive over this? Is it live? There were a lot of snakes, which I'm not particularly fond of. You know, there were red eyes up and down either side of the road because of the alligators.
Don't forget the bobcat.
Yeah, there was a bobcat that ran in front of the car.
They're like, was that a cat?
There was
That was a cat. No, that's a bushy-eared cat.
Yeah, no, there was a bobcat that ran in front of the car. There were birds. I mean, the birds are super messed up because of the wind. Okay, so they're constantly dive bobbing at your headlights. And we're in the middle of the Everglades at this point. Where we later learned we were in something called the Fakahatchee Strand, which some people refer to as the Amazon of North America. And I mean, Doug was equipped. I was scared, you know what I mean? And each time we're starting to go, I'm like, yeah, we're close, because I'm looking at the map. Yeah, we're close. And then finally, Doug was like, man, how far away are we? And I said, well, we're about halfway there.
Analyzing the depth of the water on the truck, so he would lean out of the truck, and you know, he'd have to lean almost 60 degrees out of the truck and analyze the water level on the tires, because we, you know, to get a good idea of whether it was getting higher or lower.
Yeah.
And then every once in a while a snake would come and he would fall back in the truck completely paralyzed.
Yeah, and so
there were dozens of snakes. We
reached probably like 2 or 3 a.m. at this point, and that was high tide. So we stopped the car. Doug got out of the car. I opted not to, and then we kept going to get into Everglades City. And you know, the whole way you were listening to like electronic trance music because it helped him focus. But it was so loud, and I was like, you know, it was an intense situation. But so we finally got to the end of it, and we got to the road that takes you east into Everglades City, and it was also extremely underwater, but there was a parking lot there that gave us a little bit of height, so we parked the car, and there was 3 or 4 residents who had actually evacuated that area who were also trying to get back in. I think 1 or 2 news crews, and nobody had yet been out to Everglades City, and this is around dawn. So our first step was we tried to communicate with some of the local residents to pay them cash to take us on an airboat out there because we didn't think we could drive in, and we were not successful in our bartering. So we just decided to push it, and we tried to drive in. And we were the first people to make the effort, other than some dudes in this enormous truck, residents who were really confident. And we went over there, and you kind of crest a little bit of a hill to get into Everglades City, and we were doing it at dawn. So in another situation, it would have been a really kind of beautiful, traditional Florida scene. But we crested it, and it was underwater, and it was pretty shocking.
City.
Yes, the city, which is pretty small, you know, but the town really was underwater, and it was pretty dramatic. You know, it was up halfway up the doors for most of the places that we could see. And so, because the newspaper was putting out an early edition that day, we were supposed to have 2.5 hours to file a story, and then we were suddenly told that no, that's not the case. You have 40 minutes. which is not a lot of time. And so we both hopped out of the car and started wading through the water. Doug got on the back of a truck and we separated. And we started talking to residents because a lot of the people out there stayed. The difference between, Everglades City and Marco Island is that you have a lot of full-timers there, even more so than necessarily Marco Island. And you have a lot of people who live as a part of that ecosystem. It's a huge place for airboats. It's, in terms of that region of Florida, it's what we would, refer to as a traditional Florida cracker area. These are people who live here, they grew up here, and they've been through hurricanes before, and this is their home.
And they're living on the water at sea level. They're,
right.
They have tour boats, and people are down there to see the alligators and so on. So these are people that are pretty seasoned. And they kind of expect it.
They did. And so not only were there people out there, but there were people who wanted to talk to us because they had been watching the national news broadcasts, and every single thing they had seen in the hours since Irma had hit them or gotten on text through their phone in the limited service that they could find was that Irma devastated Marco Island. It hit Marco Island. And the residents of Everglades City and just off Everglades City is Chokoloskee. And they were mad because, what about us? Which to us was an indicator of this is where the real story lies. And you could see that they had been hit so much harder by the storm because their infrastructure just wasn't as built in.
Our little town's beautiful. It's a beautiful little town. In February, 50,000 people come here for Seafood Festival, but we don't exist. Imagine that. We live off of tourists, yeah, but this is my home.
There was an older couple who were partners and they were walking through the water, and they agreed to take me because Doug had gotten on the car, and they had agreed to take me and point out some things. And he had a walking stick. They were very kind and they were very generous, but what stood out to me about it is that the whole place was sort of very clearly damaged, but they had this reaction to it that I think speaks to the character of the people. That was a mix of wonderment and sort of devastation over what had happened. But as we were going, they were pointing out the fish that were swimming, and they were trying to find like there's some amazement to what's happening here, and it was just kind of surprising to me. But I thought that it was pretty true that their whole community had been broken, but they knew it would rebuild, and that gave them some peace. And also, we live amongst nature, and look at this. Let's take it in for a second. And I thought, they were almost appreciative of it in that moment, and that definitely stood out to me. But I think that you were in the back of a pickup truck of a woman whose, whole family lost their possessions. And
oh, you're talking about the people with the restaurant?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we roll up on, I ended up getting on a pickup truck, and we rode to probably the center of town, which was just inundated with, when you say there's probably an excess of 3 to 4 feet of water in there. So anything that wasn't built on stilts was flooded. And this woman who had taken me in wanted to check on her family's restaurant, and it was obviously entirely flooded. And we had a real conversation about, what it was going to be like for her and her family to start over again. She was pretty upset. In a town that probably relies solely on tourism, and probably most of her customers that would eat at that restaurant are people that would come in and, check out the flora and the fauna and the Florida wetlands. She was pretty, it's kind of a double-edged sword for her. She's, dealing with, losing her business at the same time. There's a price to being at sea level, and there's a price to being on the water like this. We had a pretty good conversation about that.
Yeah.
I have one memory of rolling up on a airboat tours company, and it was a home, and the airboat tours were based right out of the back. And there were 7 people in there cleaning out the house and the garage, and they had that place like 80%, 90% cleaned out by the time I rolled up on them. They had used brooms and squeegees and buckets, and they had removed all the water, and they were drying the place out. It was really amazing. And they were just talking about everyday things. They were just rolling with it. So it was pretty fascinating.
It was like a lot of pain, but a lot of people prepared to get past it. And I thought that was pretty interesting. So I would say twofold. Both areas, there were people who were hurt, and I never would want to negate the experience of anyone in that situation. There was harm in both places. It just, we've spoken about how fickle a storm can be and how it can affect different people, but part of the way a storm damages whatever area it hits doesn't even have to do with the exact path it takes. It has to do with the nature of society in that area. And so, you know, with the damage of a storm, it sort of reflects, you know, class and how different environments are built and the character of that region. And that stuff all happens long before the storm comes in, but it has a big effect on how the storm actually has an impact. And, you know, I thought that definitely affected me. And, you know, I think the second thing that affected me is you just, in both places, you saw sort of the polar opposites of what Florida is. And you saw the resilience of both of those places. It's just a very different type of resilience.
I guess what I walk away with in almost every storm I walk away with this is that every storm is an unpredictable force. You can never say that two storms are the same. They change, the eye walls degrade and then they rebuild, and that eye wall cycle according to where it interacts with land, and if it's over water when the eye wall cycle rebuilds, and then when it decides to turn, all of that affects how the storm impacts the area that it hits. So in the dozen or more major storms that I've covered since 2000, I can't say that there's been two storms that I could ever predict how it would behave. As a photojournalist, Times typically would dispatch a team of one or two. In the earlier years, they would send a photographer, and the writers would be working in separate vehicles. The goal of a team or a photographer writer that's on the front end is try to penetrate to the zone where you're going to get landfall. That's where you're going to get the story. So I would typically leave a day, sometimes 2 days before landfall. We'd have a pretty educated idea where we're going to be. And then my tact would always be to have a fully stocked truck with fuel and enough food for 5 to 7 days, and then find a concrete block or a concrete and steel structure to hole out in, and then emerge after landfall and document. I'd say I can't rattle off the names of them in any great order, but I've probably covered a dozen or more major storms, and each one of them has been a different experience. I've lost a vehicle in a storm before because I did not, I guess for lack of a better word, I didn't anticipate the landfall accurately. That's the problem with these storms, is if you as a journalist, you're trying to get as close as you can to a landfall. You're trying to get as close to where the story is going to be, because the further you are from that landfall zone after the storm passes, the harder it's going to be for you to get there afterwards, just because of the debris and the infrastructure damage. So my goal has always been to be where the landfall is typically. And in this case, I was in Rodanthe and Outer Banks, and the storm was coming in. This is 2006. Is that right?
1973.
1973. I might have to mop this one up. But anyway, my vehicle became inundated with water by a wave, and it just rolled the vehicle over, and I had to abandon the vehicle and take my equipment out. So, and that had to do with the storm just coming in a little bit further north than where we had anticipated. There's just no two storms that you can say are the same.
We're in Everglades City, and we do exist. There are people here, people who help people. We help people from outside of Everglades City. So, hopefully we're going to get all the help we need.
Well, I was tasked with video and stills, and when I was down in Everglades City, although I did make stills of Everglades City, the video was much more compelling, mainly because I was able to show people interacting with the damage, just after daybreak. And we had a very compelling interview, and, I was able to show that scene where the people were cleaning out the business in the home. And I just felt like that was the story, We were able to document, real people dealing with the direct aftermath, which to me is why we're out there. And an interesting part of the process of this is transmitting and getting our work out. In this particular case, it was a nightmare because we could not get data. All the data had been, either the towers were damaged, you had to get back out to the highway system in order to hit a tower that was viable. And even later I found out that the cellular companies give data priority to the EMS services and law enforcement. So we had to drive.
We drove for 3 hours before Doug was able to submit his video, and I was on the phone while Doug was trying to submit it back to the office, and that's when they pulled us back, because they could tell that we were no longer safe being out there. Like I couldn't make a sentence because we hadn't slept in like 36 hours, and transmitting that video was an absolute nightmare. We would be driving along the road, the access road in and out of Everglades City, and he would briefly get a bar, like just for a second, and I would immediately slam on the brakes, and we would try to stay in that spot, and then it would go away, and we would keep going, and he'd briefly get a bar, and then I would go away. We drove all the way up to Naples. I think we were in Fort Myers by the time that Doug was able to actually transmit that video.
What were y'all's first hot meals after the storm?
Oh, I remember. We had something hot during the storm. We took
Must
over,
be nice.
We took over the EOC, and the TV reporters. The TV reporters hated us because we took 4 of the 5 cots. Thank you, Josh. And you fired up the single burner, and you boiled us something.
Yeah, I did. I made some food.
I don't remember what it was, but I remember for Doug and I, the first hot meal we had was an absolutely disgusting quantity of Dairy Queen.
Yeah.
And
chili cheese dogs, 4 of them.
And we were not able to hit that until Ruskin before we were able to get a hot meal. And we drove up from Everglades City.
That was something that I should have anticipated, but just that like restaurants wouldn't just immediately reopen, and even if they could, all their food they got rid of. Even just in St. Pete, I remember like calling every restaurant, and they would answer, and I'm like, "Do you have food?" And they're like, "No, we're just open for drinks." And I'm like, "I don't want any alcohol. I just want a cheeseburger. That's all I wanted." And I didn't get one until I think Tuesday, the day or whenever it was, the next day, and I went to the Berg and got a bacon blue cheeseburger and just like ate it in complete silence.
That meal was super special because I remember at the previous year we were out in Hurricane Matthew and we were in Fort Pierce, and then we were up in St. Augustine, and we finally got called back and we went for a meal, and we went to Outback, which sounded just unbelievably good. And I remember going up I went up to the hostess stand, and I was like, "Hey, can we get a table for 3?" And she said, "It'll be 6 hours." And,
Yeah.
I was like, "Oh, excuse me, okay," which was really tough. Yeah,
I was willing to wait.
I would have waited.
there are ways to improve your hurricane kit meal though, which you definitely.
Yeah, Doug, that sausage,
yeah,
killer, and
like
the cheese,
yeah, sausage and cheese, and like because Doug had the boar's head like nice sausages.
Yeah.
Don't they need to be refrigerated?
You have to spoil yourself.
You can get ice, and you can
Your
keep them for a couple of days, and then but they don't always need to be, especially if you don't cut. I mean, you eat them all in one sitting.
or if they're cured, you can. Yeah.
And then Lauren had tuna and olive oil, and he had like Triscuits.
Right, the Triscuits.
It was totally EOC chic gourmet.
It's
It
all
was.
about mixing up your texture.
Oh my God.
Right, and we were trading too, and when you have 4 people, you can kind of mix and match the food that you bring. So I was glad that we were all together there.
I just ate the M&Ms out of my trail mix.
Oh yeah.
Definitely always have a treat.
Yeah.
A hurricane kit though, because you're gonna feel beaten down at some point. Doug also, another lesson I learned from Doug, who's a wily old veteran, is that he always has he always gets the powdered sugar donuts, which we had, which were really nice.
Yeah.
And anytime you can stop and get gas, you should also stop and get some kind of food.
100%.
Anytime you get gas, you should also see if you can get some food. Because I still haven't eaten beefaroni since, nor do I ever want to again.
Yeah.
All right, I think that'll do it.